Hey there, and welcome to Dark Creaky TV. If you're new, hit that subscribe button for spine-tingling Reddit creepypasta stories that are perfect for a night of chilling thrills. Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and let's get into tonight's stories. The Ouija board brought back my dead friend, and now they won't leave. I never thought I'd be the one to write one of these stories, but after what happened, I can't keep this to myself. Maybe someone out there has a solution, or at least some advice. I just need to get this out before I lose my mind. It all started a month ago. My best friend Jake had died in a car accident 6 months earlier. He was only 26. We had been inseparable since middle school, and losing him left a massive void in my life. I couldn't get over it. The grief was suffocating. I know it sounds cliche, but I felt like a part of me died with him. His laughter, his stupid jokes, the way he always had my back no matter what, all gone. One night, after way too many beers, my buddy Tom suggested we try contacting Jake using a Ouija board. He was always into that supernatural crap, and while I never really believed in it, I was drunk and desperate. Maybe it was just the alcohol talking, but the thought of hearing from Jake again, even just once, sounded like the best idea ever. We set up the board in my living room. The lights were dim, and the candles flickered ominously. Tom, his girlfriend Sarah, and I sat in a circle around the board, our fingers barely touching the planchette. Tom started the session, asking if there was any spirit who wanted to communicate with us. At first, nothing happened. I felt a mix of relief and disappointment, but then the planchette started to move, slowly at first, then with more urgency. It spelled out Jake. My heart skipped a beat. Could it really be him? Tom asked more questions, and the answers we got were eerily accurate. It knew things only Jake would know. The nickname he had for his dog, the place we buried our time capsule when we were 12. It had to be him. We asked Jake how he was, where he was, if he was happy. The planchette moved again, spelling out DARK COLD PLEASEHELP. My blood ran cold. This wasn't what I had expected. I just wanted to hear from my friend, not find out he was suffering. Tom, ever the thrill seeker, suggested we ask if there was a way to bring him back. It was a stupid, impulsive question, but before I could object, the planchette started moving again. YES. That one word changed everything. We asked how, and the board spelled out a series of instructions. It told us to get a personal item of Jake's and perform a ritual at the place where he died. Desperation and hope clouded my judgment. Against my better instincts, I agreed to go along with it. I mean, what if it worked? What if I could bring my best friend back? We gathered what we needed. An old hoodie of Jake's that he had left at my place, a few candles, and some other items the board had specified. We drove to the intersection where Jake had crashed. It was late, past midnight, and the place was eerily quiet. The streetlights flickered, casting long shadows on the asphalt. We set up the candles in a circle, placed the hoodie in the center, and started chanting the words the board had given us. As we did, the wind picked up, howling through the trees. I felt a cold chill run down my spine, but I couldn't stop now. We continued chanting, and the air grew thicker, more oppressive. It felt like something was watching us. Then, out of nowhere, the candles blew out. We were plunged into darkness, and I heard a noise, a low, guttural growl, like nothing I'd ever heard before. We fumbled to relight the candles, but before we could, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I turned around, and there he was, Jake. But it wasn't really him. His eyes were empty, hollow. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and there was a sickly, unnatural aura about him. He looked at me with a mixture of sorrow and anger, and I knew we had made a terrible mistake. He wasn't supposed to be here. "I'm so cold," he whispered, his voice raspy and weak. "You have to help me." I tried to reach out to him, but my hand passed right through his. He let out a scream, a blood-curdling, soul-piercing scream that echoed through the night. I covered my ears, but it didn't help. The sound was inside my head, tearing through my thoughts, my memories. I felt like I was losing my mind. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the scream stopped. Jake was gone. The candles were relit, but the flame was a sickly green, casting eerie shadows around us. Tom and Sarah were as shaken as I was. We didn't speak. We just packed up and left as quickly as we could. I thought that would be the end of it, a horrible experience that we would never talk about again. But I was wrong. So wrong. It started small objects in my apartment moving on their own, cold spots that seemed to follow me from room to room. I'd hear whispers in the middle of the night, unintelligible but undeniably real. At first I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, that I was still shaken from the ritual. But things escalated. I started seeing Jake everywhere, in the mirror, in the windows, even standing at the foot of my bed at night. He would just stare at me with those hollow eyes, silently pleading for help. I couldn't escape him. I couldn't sleep. I was losing my mind. One night, I woke up to find him sitting on my chest, his cold, lifeless hands around my throat. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. I felt my vision darkening, my life slipping away. But just as I was about to pass out, he let go. I gasped for air, my heart pounding in my chest. He leaned in close, his face inches from mine. "You brought me back," he whispered, his voice a cold, hollow echo. "Now you have to help me. You have to finish what you started." I don't know what to do. I'm terrified. I'm desperate. I need help. If anyone has any idea how to fix this, please, for the love of God, tell me. I can't live like this anymore. Jake won't leave me alone, and I'm afraid of what he'll do next. After that night, I couldn't shake the feeling of Jake's icy hands around my throat. I was a wreck, barely sleeping, and when I did manage to drift off, the nightmares were relentless. My boss noticed my decline and suggested I take some time off. I didn't argue. There was no way I could focus on work while I was being haunted by my dead best friend. Tom and Sarah came over a few days later. They looked just as haggard as I felt. It seemed I wasn't the only one Jake had been visiting. Tom admitted that he'd been seeing shadows in his house and hearing footsteps at night. Sarah confessed that she'd been waking up with bruises she couldn't explain. We were all terrified, but we didn't know what to do. "Maybe we should go back to the board," Tom suggested hesitantly. "Maybe we can ask it how to fix this." I was reluctant, but what other choice did we have? We were way in over our heads, and it was clear that whatever we had unleashed wasn't going away on its own. That night, we set up the Ouija board again. The atmosphere was even more oppressive than before, like the air itself was heavier. "Is there a spirit here with us?" Tom asked, his voice trembling slightly. The planchette moved immediately. YES. "Jake, is that you?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. Again, the planchette moved to yes. "What do you want?" Sarah asked, her voice cracking. HELPME. My heart sank. We had already tried to help him, and look where it got us. I took a deep breath and asked, "How do we help you, Jake?" The planchette moved slowly, deliberately. DOWHATISAY. I glanced at Tom and Sarah. Their faces were pale, eyes wide with fear, but they nodded. We didn't have a choice. "What do you need us to do?" I asked. The board spelled out a series of instructions, even more cryptic and disturbing than the last time. It told us to gather certain items, a mirror, a knife, and something that belonged to each of us. Then we had to return to the place where Jake died and perform another ritual. This time, there were more chants, and we had to draw symbols on the ground with our own blood. It sounded insane, but we were desperate. Over the next few days, we gathered everything we needed. The mirror was an old one I found at a thrift store. The knife was a hunting knife Tom had, and we each brought something personal. Tom's high school ring, Sarah's bracelet, and my old baseball cap that Jake and I had found together at a flea market years ago. We returned to the intersection late at night. The air was unnaturally cold, and the street was eerily silent. We set up the items as instructed, the mirror in the centre, the knife placed beside it, and our personal items forming a triangle around them. We drew the symbols on the ground with our blood, the cuts on our hands stinging in the cold air. We started chanting, the same strange words the board had given us. As we did, the wind picked up, and the air grew thicker, almost suffocating. Shadows seemed to gather around us, moving closer, and I felt the same sense of being watched as before. Then, the mirror began to fog up, like someone was breathing on it from the other side. Slowly, words appeared on the glass, written in reverse. It took me a moment to realize they were spelling out a message. SHATTERIT. Tom picked up the knife, his hand shaking. He hesitated, looking at me and Sarah for reassurance. We both nodded, and he brought the knife down on the mirror. It shattered with a deafening crash, pieces flying everywhere. For a moment, everything was still. Then, a piercing scream echoed through the night. A scream that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The shadows around us writhed and twisted, and I felt a sharp, burning pain in my chest. I looked down to see a deep gash across my shirt, blood seeping through the fabric. I collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. Tom and Sarah rushed to my side, their faces pale with fear. The wind died down, and the oppressive atmosphere seemed to lift slightly. But I knew it wasn't over. Jake wasn't done with us yet. Over the next few days, the hauntings escalated. I would find messages scrawled in blood on my walls. "Help me, you promised. Why did you leave me?" And Jake's apparition became more aggressive. He would appear in my bedroom at night, his eyes hollow and accusing, his presence sending chills down my spine. One night, I woke up to find him standing over my bed, his face inches from mine. His eyes were filled with a mixture of anger and desperation, and he spoke in a voice that was both his and something else, something darker. "You can't escape me," he whispered. "You brought me back, and now you have to finish it. You have to help me." "I'm trying," I screamed, tears streaming down my face. "I don't know what you want from me." He leaned in closer, his breath icy cold on my skin. "You have to bring me back completely. You have to finish what you started." I didn't know what he meant, but I knew I had to find out. I couldn't keep living like this, haunted by my best friend, tormented by the guilt and fear. I had to find a way to fix this, to help Jake and set things right. But I had no idea how. Tom and Sarah were just as lost as I was. We tried researching more about Ouija boards, spirits, and rituals, but nothing we found seemed to match our situation. We were alone in this, fumbling in the dark, and I could feel the darkness closing in around us. One night, as I lay in bed, unable to sleep, I heard a whisper in my ear. It was Jake's voice, but it was different, more urgent, more desperate. "Go back to the board," he whispered. "There's one more thing you need to do." I sat up, my heart pounding. The thought of using the Ouija board again terrified me, but I didn't see any other option. I had to know what Jake wanted, what we needed to do to end this nightmare. The next day, I called Tom and Sarah and told them what had happened. They were reluctant, but they agreed to meet me at my place that night. We set up the board once more, our fingers trembling as they touched the planchette. "Jake, we're here," I said. "What do we need to do to help you?" The planchette moved slowly, almost reluctantly. "FINDTHEBOOK. "What book?" Tom asked, confusion evident in his voice. The planchette moved again, spelling out a series of letters and numbers. I realized it was an address. "Is this where the book is?" Sarah asked. Yes, we had a new mission. We had to find the book, whatever it was, and figure out how it could help Jake. I didn't know what we were getting ourselves into, but I knew we had to try, for Jake's sake and for ours. The address Jake had given us led to an old, decrepit house on the outskirts of town. It was one of those places you see in horror movies, the kind that makes your skin crawl just looking at it. The windows were boarded up, and the yard was overgrown with weeds. It looked abandoned, but there was something about it that felt alive, like the house itself was watching us. We stood in front of the house, hesitating. The air was thick with tension, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. But we had come this far. We couldn't turn back now. Tom took a deep breath and pushed open the creaky gate. We made our way up the cracked walkway, our footsteps echoing in the silence. The front door was unlocked. It swung open with a loud groan, revealing a dark, musty interior. The smell of decay hit us like a punch to the gut, and I had to fight the urge to gag. We stepped inside, the floorboards creaking under our weight. The house was a mess, furniture overturned, dust and cobwebs everywhere. It looked like no one had lived there for decades. "Let's find that book and get out of here," Sarah said, her voice shaking. We split up to search the house. I took the living room, Tom headed upstairs, and Sarah went into the kitchen. The living room was filled with old, dusty furniture and piles of newspapers. I started sifting through the mess, hoping to find something that looked like a book. After what felt like hours of searching, I heard Tom call out from upstairs. "I think I found something." I rushed up the stairs, the old wood groaning under my feet. Tom was standing in a small, cluttered bedroom. In his hands was an old, leather-bound book. It looked ancient, the cover worn and faded. There was no title, just a strange symbol etched into the leather. "This has to be it," Tom said, his voice barely more than a whisper. We gathered in the bedroom, the book lying open on the dusty bed. The pages were filled with strange symbols and writing in a language none of us could understand. As we flipped through the pages, a sense of dread washed over me. Whatever this book was, it wasn't something we should be messing with. "Look at this," Sarah said, pointing to a page near the back of the book. There was a drawing of a ritual, similar to the one we had performed, but more elaborate. The instructions were written in the same strange language, but there were symbols and diagrams that we recognized. A mirror, a knife, candles, and something that looked like a human figure. "This has to be it," Tom said. "This is how we finish it." We took the book back to my apartment. The whole drive back, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that something was following us. We spread the book out on the kitchen table and tried to decipher the instructions. It took us hours, but we finally pieced together enough to understand what we needed to do. The new ritual required us to return to the place where Jake died. But this time, we needed more than just our personal items. We needed a part of Jake, a piece of his physical body. The thought made me sick to my stomach, but we had come this far. We couldn't back out now. We went to the cemetery that night. The air was cold and still, the moon casting an eerie glow over the gravestones. We found Jake's grave, the earth still fresh from his recent burial. My hands trembled as I dug into the soil, the reality of what we were doing hitting me like a ton of bricks. After what felt like hours, my fingers brushed against something solid. I pulled it out, a small bone fragment. I tried not to think about what part of Jake it had come from. We returned to the intersection with the book, the bone fragment, and the rest of the items. The air was thick with tension, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. We set everything up as instructed. The candles, the mirror, the knife, and the bone fragment in the center. We started chanting the words from the book, our voices shaking. As we chanted, the air grew colder, and the shadows around us seemed to come alive. I felt a presence, a dark, oppressive force that made it hard to breathe. The ground beneath us started to shake, and a low, guttural growl echoed through the night. I looked around, but there was nothing there. Just darkness and shadows. The mirror fogged up again, and words appeared on the glass, written in reverse. HELPME. We continued chanting, the words spilling out of our mouths faster and faster. The growling grew louder, and I felt a sharp pain in my chest, like something was trying to rip my heart out. I collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. Tom and Sarah were shouting, but their voices were drowned out by the growling. Then, everything went silent. I looked up to see Jake standing in the center of the circle, but it wasn't the Jake I knew. His eyes were black, empty voids, and his skin was pale and lifeless. He looked at me with a mixture of anger and sorrow, and I knew we had made a terrible mistake. "You promised to help me," he said, his voice a cold, hollow echo. "You brought me back, but But you didn't finish it. Now you have to pay. He stepped towards me, his eyes boring into mine. I tried to move, but I was paralyzed with fear. He reached out and placed his hand on my chest. I felt a cold, burning sensation, like his touch was freezing my heart. I screamed, the pain unbearable. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the pain stopped. Jake was gone. The candles were out, and the air was still. I looked around, my heart pounding in my chest. Tom and Sarah were on the ground, their faces pale with fear. "We need to get out of here," Tom said, his voice shaking. We packed up and left as quickly as we could. The drive back to my apartment was silent, each of us lost in our own thoughts. We had done what the book instructed, but it felt like we had made things worse. Over the next few days, the hauntings became more intense. Objects would fly across the room, and the whispers in the night grew louder, more urgent. I would wake up with scratches on my body, and I could feel Jake's presence more strongly than ever. He was angry, and he wasn't going to stop until he got what he wanted. I don't know what to do. We followed the instructions, did everything we were supposed to, but it didn't work. Jake is still here, still haunting us, and I'm afraid of what he'll do next. If anyone has any idea how to fix this, please, for the love of God, tell me. I can't keep living like this. The days after the failed ritual blurred together in a haze of fear and confusion. I was barely sleeping, and when I did, the nightmares were relentless. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Jake, his hollow eyes, his cold touch. The scratches and bruises on my body were getting worse, and I could feel myself slipping further into madness. Tom and Sarah were just as bad off. Sarah called me one night, sobbing uncontrollably. She said she saw Jake in her apartment, standing in the corner of her bedroom, just watching her. Tom wasn't doing any better. He had started drinking heavily, trying to numb the fear and guilt that were eating him alive. We needed help, real help, not the kind you get from a dusty old book. We needed someone who actually knew what they were doing. I started searching online, looking for anyone who might be able to help us. That's when I found her. Her name was Marla, a paranormal investigator with a reputation for dealing with hauntings and dark entities. Her website was filled with testimonials from people she had helped, and it seemed like she might be our last hope. I reached out to her, explaining everything that had happened. To my surprise, she agreed to meet us. Marla arrived at my apartment a few days later. She was in her late 40s, with long, greying hair and sharp, piercing eyes. She exuded a calm, confident presence that immediately put me at ease. She listened to our story without interruption, her expression growing more serious as we went on. "This is very bad," she said when we finished. "You've not just contacted your friend, you've opened a door to something much darker. Jake's spirit is trapped, but there's something else, something malevolent, using his presence to anchor itself to this world." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. Marla took a deep breath. "We need to perform a cleansing ritual to banish the dark entity and free Jake's spirit. It's dangerous, and there are no guarantees, but it's the only way to set things right." We gathered that night at the intersection where Jake had died. Marla had brought everything we needed for the ritual: candles, herbs, and various other items I didn't recognize. She instructed us to form a circle around Jake's grave, holding hands to create a protective barrier. As Marla began chanting, the air grew cold, and the shadows seemed to close in around us. The candles flickered, casting eerie shapes on the ground. I could feel the presence of something dark and malevolent, lurking just beyond the circle of light. Marla's chants grew louder, more urgent. The ground beneath us trembled, and I felt a pressure building in my chest, like something was trying to tear its way out. I glanced at Tom and Sarah. Their faces were pale, eyes wide with fear, but they held firm. Suddenly, the wind picked up, howling through the trees. The candles blew out, plunging us into darkness. I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder, and I knew it was Jake. His voice echoed in my mind, a desperate, pleading whisper. "Help me!" I squeezed my eyes shut, focusing on Marla's voice. The chanting reached a fever pitch, and I felt the pressure in my chest release with a sudden, Violent force. A blood-curdling scream echoed through the night, and I knew it wasn't Jake's. The wind died down, and the air grew still. Marla finished the ritual, her voice softening to a whisper. The darkness seemed to lift, and I felt a strange sense of peace wash over me. I opened my eyes to see Jake standing before me, his eyes no longer hollow and empty. "Thank you," he said, his voice calm and clear. "I'm free now." I felt tears streaming down my face. "I'm so sorry, Jake. I never meant for any of this to happen." He shook his head. "It's not your fault. You did what you thought was right. Now it's time for me to go." He reached out and placed his hand on my shoulder. This time, it was warm, comforting. I felt a sense of closure, of finality. Then, he was gone. Marla let out a long breath, her shoulders slumping with exhaustion. "It's done," she said. "The dark entity is banished, and Jake's spirit is free." We thanked Marla profusely, but she waved it off. "Just be careful in the future," she warned. "The supernatural is not something to be taken lightly." We returned to our lives, trying to put the pieces back together. The hauntings stopped, and the scratches and bruises faded, but the memory of what happened would never leave us. I still see Jake sometimes, in my dreams, but it's different now. He's at peace, and so am I. But I'll never forget the lesson I learned. Some doors are better left unopened, and some spirits should be left to rest. Life slowly started to return to normal after that night. The apartment felt lighter, the oppressive presence that had plagued me gone. Tom and Sarah began to heal as well, though the scars of our experience would always linger beneath the surface. We had survived something unimaginable, and that bond kept us close, even as we tried to move on with our lives. A few months passed without incident. I started seeing a therapist to help deal with the trauma and the guilt. Tom quit drinking, and Sarah found solace in meditation and yoga. We were all trying to find our own ways to cope, but peace is fragile. One night, I was home alone, trying to unwind after a particularly tough day at work. I had just finished dinner and was about to settle in front of the TV when I heard a noise. It was faint, a soft, whispering sound, almost like someone was calling my name. I froze, my heart pounding. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as the whisper grew louder, more insistent. "Mark!" I turned towards the sound, and my blood ran cold. The living room mirror, the same one we had used in the ritual, was fogging up. Slowly, words began to appear on the glass, written in that same eerie, reversed script. HELPME. My heart raced. This couldn't be happening again. We had banished the entity, freed Jake's spirit. I grabbed my phone and called Tom and Sarah. They arrived within minutes, both of them as terrified as I was. The three of us stood in front of the mirror, watching as the message slowly faded away. "We need to call Marla," Sarah said, her voice trembling. Marla arrived later that night, her face grim. She examined the mirror, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Something is still here," she said finally. "I'm not sure how, but we must have missed something during the ritual." We retraced our steps, going over everything we had done that night. Marla's face grew darker with each detail we recounted. "There might have been another spirit," she said, "one that latched onto Jake's presence, hiding in the shadows." My stomach turned. "What do we do?" "We have to perform another cleansing," Marla said. "But this time, we need to make sure we banish every trace of the dark entity." We gathered the necessary items once again, the sense of dread settling over us like a heavy fog. Marla led us in a new ritual, more intense and complex than before. As we chanted, the air grew thick, and the shadows around us seemed to pulse with a life of their own. The mirror fogged up again, and a dark, twisted figure appeared within the glass. It wasn't Jake. This thing was something else entirely, a grotesque, malevolent presence that seemed to feed off our fear. The candles flickered, and the room grew icy cold. Marla's chants grew louder, more forceful. The dark figure writhed and twisted, trying to escape, but Marla held firm. The mirror began to crack, spiderwebbing from the center outwards. The dark entity let out a horrifying scream, a sound that seemed to cut through to my very soul. Finally, with a deafening shatter, The mirror exploded, sending shards of glass flying across the room. The dark figure vanished, and the air grew still. The oppressive presence lifted, leaving behind a strange, almost serene silence. "It's over," Marla said, her voice shaky with exhaustion. "The dark entity is gone for good this time." We cleaned up the shattered glass, our hands trembling. The relief was palpable, but so was the exhaustion. We had been through hell and back, and now, finally, it was truly over. Marla stayed with us for a while, making sure everything was okay before she left. She gave us instructions on how to cleanse our homes and protect ourselves from future encounters. I followed her advice to the letter, determined never to let anything like this happen again. The hauntings stopped for good. The scratches and bruises healed, and the nightmares faded. Jake visited me in my dreams from time to time, but it was different now. He was at peace, his eyes clear and full of the warmth I remembered. He would smile and tell me to be careful, to live my life and cherish the moments we had. Tom, Sarah, and I remained close, our bond forged in the fires of our shared trauma. We talked about what happened sometimes, but mostly we tried to move forward, to find happiness and peace in our everyday lives. But the lesson we learned stayed with us. The supernatural is real, and it is not something to be trifled with. Some doors are better left closed, some spirits left to rest in peace. And as for Ouija boards, I'll never touch one again. In the end, we survived. We came out the other side stronger, wiser, but forever changed. The memory of what happened, the terror we faced, will always be a part of us. But we learned to live with it, to find peace in the knowledge that Jake was finally free, and so were we. Life goes on, but the shadows of the past linger. We move forward, but we never forget. The Ouija board knew my deepest, darkest secrets. Hey Reddit, I've never shared this story before, and I don't even know where to start. I've been through some pretty messed up stuff, but nothing compares to this. I need to get it off my chest, and maybe, just maybe, someone will believe me. Strap in, because this is going to be a wild ride. It all started a few years back. I was a junior in college, living with 3 friends in an off-campus apartment. We were your typical broke students, scraping by on instant noodles and cheap beer. One night, after a particularly stressful week of exams, we decided to blow off some steam. Sarah, my roommate, had found an old Ouija board at a garage sale and thought it would be fun to try it out. None of us believed in that kind of stuff, but we were bored and a little tipsy, so why not? We gathered around our coffee table, lit a few candles for ambience, and placed our fingers on the planchette. It started as a joke. We asked the usual silly questions like, "Is anyone there?" and "What's your name?" We were laughing, pushing the planchette around, trying to spook each other out. But then things got weird. The planchette moved to spell out DEATH. We all accused each other of messing around, but no one admitted to it. I started to feel a cold chill down my spine. Sarah asked, "Who are you?" The planchette slowly moved again, spelling out SECRETS. We laughed nervously, but there was an uneasy feeling in the room. I decided to ask a question, trying to lighten the mood. "What kind of secrets?" I said, smirking. The planchette didn't hesitate. It spelled out YOURS. My heart skipped a beat. The others laughed it off, but I felt a wave of dread wash over me. I hadn't told anyone about my past, not even my closest friends. There were things I'd buried deep, things I never wanted anyone to know. I shook it off, trying to convince myself it was just a coincidence. We kept playing for a while longer, but the atmosphere had shifted. The board seemed to know things, personal things. It called out Sarah for cheating on her boyfriend. It mentioned David's struggle with depression, and it even knew about Lisa's strained relationship with her parents. We were all freaked out, but no one wanted to admit it. Then it was my turn again. "What do you know about me?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. The planchette moved with a speed and certainty that made my blood run cold. BARN. My breath caught in my throat. No one else would understand, but I knew exactly what it meant. When I was a kid, I used to visit my grandparents' farm every summer. One summer, when I was about 10, something terrible happened. My cousin and I were playing in the old barn when we found a stray dog. It was sick, foaming at the mouth. I wanted to help it, but my cousin was scared. He told me to leave it alone, but I didn't listen. I tried to get closer, and it bit me. I panicked, grabbed a pitchfork, and I still have nightmares about that day. The dog's whimpers, the blood, the way my cousin looked at me. I never told anyone what really happened. I said the dog ran away, and no one questioned it, but I could never forget. Now, sitting there in our apartment, staring at the Ouija board, I felt like I was 10 years old again, standing in that barn. My friends were looking at me, waiting for an explanation. I couldn't speak. I just shook my head and got up, mumbling something about needing air. I went outside, my mind racing. How could the board know? It was impossible. I sat on the steps, trying to calm down. After a while, the others came out, joking about how weird it was. I forced a laugh and said I was fine, but inside, I was terrified. Over the next few days, things got worse. I started having nightmares about the barn again. I could hear the dog's whimpers, see its bloodied body. I began to feel like I was being watched, even when I was alone. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. Then the messages started. At first, it was just little things. Notes slipped under my door. Texts from unknown numbers. They all said the same thing. "I know what you did." I tried to ignore it, but the messages kept coming. They got more detailed, describing the barn, the dog, my cousin. I couldn't take it anymore. I confronted my friends, accusing them of playing a sick joke, but they all swore they had nothing to do with it. One night, I was home alone, trying to study for a midterm. I heard a noise from the living room and went to check it out. The Ouija board was on the coffee table, even though we had put it away. The planchette started moving on its own, spelling out BARN over and over again. I screamed, threw the board across the room, and ran to my bedroom, locking the door behind me. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I found the board back on the coffee table, the planchette in the centre. I called my mum, told her everything, and she insisted I come home for a while. I packed my bags and left that afternoon, not telling my roommates where I was going. At my parents' house, I felt a little safer, but the nightmares continued. My mum suggested I see a therapist, and I agreed. I needed to talk to someone about what was happening. The therapist listened patiently as I poured out my story, nodding and taking notes. She suggested it might be a manifestation of guilt and trauma, that my mind was playing tricks on me. I wanted to believe her, but the messages didn't stop. They followed me to my parents' house, escalating in intensity. One night, I found a note on my pillow. "You can't hide from your past." I broke down, crying, feeling completely helpless. That's when I decided to go back to the barn. I needed to face my fears, confront whatever was haunting me. I drove to my grandparents' old farm, now abandoned and overgrown. The barn was still there, looking as dilapidated as ever. I took a deep breath and stepped inside. The smell hit me first. Musty, decaying wood, mixed with something rotten. I walked to the spot where it happened, my heart pounding. The memories flooded back, more vivid than ever. I knelt down, whispering an apology to the dog, to my cousin, to myself. As I stood up, I saw something move out of the corner of my eye. I turned, and there, in the shadows, was the dog. It looked exactly as I remembered, eyes full of pain and accusation. I stumbled back, my mind screaming that it wasn't real, but it felt so real. The dog started to move towards me, its growl low and menacing. I backed up, tripping over a broken board, and fell to the ground. The dog was right in front of me now, its breath hot and foul. It spoke, in a voice that was both the dog's and something else, something darker. "You can't escape," it said. You will pay for what you did, I screamed, scrambling to my feet and running out of the barn. I didn't stop until I was back in my car, shaking and crying. I drove home, my mind a whirl of terror and confusion. I thought facing my fear would help, but it only made things worse. The messages became more threatening, the nightmares more intense. I felt like I was losing my mind. My friends tried to help, but they didn't understand. How could they? They didn't believe in the supernatural, and I couldn't blame them. I'm sharing this here because I don't know what else to do. Maybe someone out there has experienced something similar. Maybe someone can help. I don't know how much more I can take. The Ouija board knew my deepest, darkest secrets, and now it won't let me forget. Hey Reddit, it's me again. I didn't think I'd be back, but things have gotten worse, and I need to tell someone. I hope someone out there is listening. After my visit to the barn, I thought things couldn't get any worse. I was wrong. I started seeing the dog everywhere. At first it was just in my dreams, but then I started seeing it during the day too. I'd catch a glimpse of it in the corner of my eye, but when I turned to look, it was gone. The worst part was the smell. That same rotten, decaying smell from the barn. It would come out of nowhere, filling my nostrils and making me gag. I went back to my therapist, told her everything. She tried to reassure me, saying it was just my mind playing tricks on me. She prescribed some medication to help with the anxiety and suggested I try meditation. I wanted to believe her, but it felt so real. Too real. One night, I was lying in bed, trying to calm my racing thoughts. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, a message from an unknown number. "You can't escape," it read. My heart pounded in my chest. I tried to block the number, but the messages kept coming from different numbers. "You will pay," "the barn," "secrets never stay buried." I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to tell my parents everything. They needed to know what was happening. Maybe they could help. I sat them down in the living room, my hands shaking as I recounted everything. The Ouija board, the messages, the dog, the barn. They listened, their faces a mix of concern and disbelief. When I finished, there was a long silence. Finally, my dad spoke. "We need to get rid of that board," he said. "It's clearly causing you a lot of stress." My mum nodded in agreement. We drove back to my apartment that night, determined to destroy the board once and for all. When we got there, my roommates were out. I went straight to the closet where we had stored the board. It was gone. I searched the entire apartment, but it was nowhere to be found. My parents tried to calm me down, saying it was probably just misplaced, but I knew better. The board was gone, and I had a feeling it wasn't by accident. The next few days were a blur. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. I felt like I was losing my mind. The messages kept coming, more frequent and more threatening. I stopped going to classes, too scared to leave my room. My friends were worried, but they didn't understand. They couldn't. One night, I heard a scratching at my bedroom door. My heart stopped. I knew what it was. I could smell it, that same rotten, decaying smell. I sat up in bed, my eyes fixed on the door. The scratching grew louder, more frantic. I grabbed a baseball bat from under my bed, my hands shaking. I slowly opened the door, ready to swing, but there was nothing there, just the dark, empty hallway. I stepped out, my eyes darting around, trying to see in the dim light. The smell was overwhelming, making my eyes water. I heard a low growl from the living room and turned, my breath catching in my throat. There, standing in the middle of the room, was the dog. Its eyes glowed in the darkness, its fur matted and covered in dried blood. It growled again, low and menacing. I froze, my mind screaming at me to run, but my body wouldn't move. The dog took a step towards me, its eyes never leaving mine. I could feel its hot breath on my skin, the smell making me gag. It spoke again, in that same dark voice. "You will pay for what you did," it said. "Secrets never stay buried." I stumbled back, tripping over a chair and falling to the floor. The dog was on me in an instant, its teeth bared. I screamed, swinging the bat wildly, but it went right through the dog as if it wasn't there. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding in my chest, and ran to my bedroom, slamming the door behind me. I could hear the dog's growl on the other side of the door, but it didn't try to get in. I sat there, my back against the door, shaking and crying. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I packed a bag and left. I couldn't stay there anymore. I moved back in with my parents, but the dog followed me. I saw it everywhere, in the yard, in the house, even in my dreams. The messages kept coming, more threatening than ever. I was living in a constant state of fear, unable to escape. One day, I got a message that made my blood run cold. Your cousin remembers. My cousin, the one who was with me in the barn that day. I hadn't spoken to him in years. We had drifted apart after that summer, each of us too haunted by what had happened. I called him, my hands shaking. He answered on the third ring, his voice wary. "Hey," I said, my voice trembling. "It's me. We need to talk." We met at a coffee shop, both of us looking worse for wear. I told him everything, from the Ouija board to the messages to the dog. He listened, his face pale. When I finished, he looked at me with haunted eyes. "I've been getting the messages too," he said, "for years. I thought I was losing my mind. But hearing you, it's real, isn't it?" I nodded, my heart sinking. We were both trapped in this nightmare, haunted by the past. We needed to find a way to end it, but I had no idea where to start. That's where things stand now, Reddit. I'm living in constant fear, unable to escape the past. My cousin and I are trying to figure out what to do, but we're both terrified. I don't know how much more I can take. If anyone out there has any advice, please, I'm begging you. I need help. Hey Reddit, it's me again. I didn't expect to be back so soon, but things have taken a turn for the worse. I feel like I'm losing my mind, and I don't know how much longer I can keep this up. After meeting with my cousin, we decided to dig deeper into the history of the barn and the Ouija board. We needed to find some kind of connection, something that could explain why this was happening to us. We started by researching the farm's history, hoping to uncover some dark secret that might be the key to ending this nightmare. The farm had been in our family for generations, but there was one period in its history that stood out. In the early 1900s, there was a string of mysterious deaths on the property. The local newspaper archives detailed a series of gruesome accidents and unexplained disappearances, all centered around the barn. There were rumors of occult, dark rituals, and sacrifices. The stories were chilling, but they felt like the pieces of a puzzle starting to come together. We also looked into the Ouija board. Sarah, my roommate, had gotten it from a garage sale, but we managed to track down the original owner. It turned out the board had a sinister history. It had been used in seances and occult practices for decades, and many of its previous owners had met untimely, often violent ends. The board seemed to carry a curse, one that had now latched onto us. We were horrified, but determined to find a solution. My cousin suggested we try to communicate with whatever was haunting us, to see if we could reason with it or find out what it wanted. It sounded crazy, but we were desperate. We decided to hold a séance in the barn, hoping to confront the spirit directly. That night, we gathered in the barn, armed with candles and a makeshift altar. The air was thick with tension and fear. We lit the candles and sat in a circle, holding hands. My cousin started to chant, calling out to the spirit, asking it to show itself. At first, nothing happened. We sat there in the dark, the flickering candlelight casting eerie shadows on the walls. Then, the temperature dropped suddenly, and a cold wind blew through the barn, extinguishing the candles. We were plunged into darkness, and that's when we heard it, a low, guttural growl, followed by the sound of claws scraping against wood. I could feel the dog's presence before I saw it. The rotten, decaying smell filled the air, making me gag. My cousin lit a flashlight, and there it was, standing at the edge of the circle, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. It looked even more horrifying than before, its body twisted and broken, yet somehow still standing. The dog stepped forward, its growl growing louder. My cousin tried to speak to it, asking what it wanted, but the dog didn't respond. It lunged at him, knocking him to the ground. I screamed, trying to pull the dog off him, but my hands passed right through it. The dog turned to me, its eyes burning with anger and pain. "You can't escape," it said in that dark, menacing voice. "You will pay for what you did." I backed up, my heart pounding in my chest. My cousin managed to scramble to his feet, his face pale and bleeding. He grabbed my hand, pulling me towards the door. We ran out of the barn, the dog's growls echoing behind us. We didn't stop running until we reached my car. We jumped in, locking the doors behind us. My cousin was shaking, his eyes wide with fear. "What are we going to do?" he asked, his voice trembling. "I don't know," I said, my mind racing. "But we can't give up. There has to be a way to stop this." Over the next few days, we tried everything we could think of. We spoke to priests, shamans, and paranormal experts, but no one had any answers. The messages continued, more relentless and terrifying than ever. I could feel the dog's presence constantly, watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. One night, I woke up to find the dog standing at the foot of my bed. Its eyes glowed in the darkness, and the smell of decay was overwhelming. It didn't move, just stared at me with those accusing eyes. "You can't hide from your past," it said. "You will pay for your sins." I screamed, throwing whatever I could reach at it, but it didn't flinch. My parents burst into the room, turning on the lights, but the dog was gone. They tried to comfort me, but I could see the fear in their eyes. They were starting to believe me, but they didn't know how to help. That's when my cousin called me with a new idea. He had found a local historian who specialized in the occult. She had agreed to meet with us and see if she could help. We were desperate, so we agreed to meet her the next day. We arrived at her house, a small, cluttered place filled with books and strange artifacts. She greeted us warmly, her eyes full of curiosity and concern. We told her everything, from the Ouija board to the barn to the dog. She listened intently, taking notes and asking questions. When we finished, she sat back, her face serious. "I've heard of cases like yours before," she said. "Spirits tied to places or objects, seeking revenge for past wrongs. It sounds like the spirit is using the dog as a vessel to torment you. But why us?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Why won't it leave us alone?" "It's seeking justice," she said. "It believes you need to atone for your sins. The only way to stop it is to confront your past and make amends." I felt a cold chill run down my spine. I had tried to make peace with what happened, but it wasn't enough. The spirit wanted more. It wanted retribution. "How do we do that?" my cousin asked, his voice filled with desperation. The historian looked at us with a mix of pity and determination. "You need to go back to the barn," she said. "Face the spirit directly, apologize, show remorse, and offer something in return. Only then will it be satisfied." The thought of going back to the barn filled me with dread, but I knew we had no other choice. We had to face the spirit, no matter how terrifying it was. That night, we prepared for what felt like a final confrontation. We gathered candles, offerings, and everything the historian suggested. My cousin and I drove back to the farm, our hearts heavy with fear and determination. As we entered the barn, the air grew cold, and the smell of decay hit us immediately. We lit the candles, setting up the altar in the center of the barn. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely hold the matches. We stood in the circle, holding hands, and began to call out to the spirit. The temperature dropped even further, and the dog appeared, its eyes glowing with anger and pain. I took a deep breath, stepping forward. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice trembling. "I'm sorry for what happened. I never meant to hurt anyone. Please, forgive me." The dog growled, its eyes narrowing. My cousin joined me, his voice shaking. "We were just kids," he said. "We didn't know what we were doing. Please, let us make it right." We placed the offerings on the altar, flowers, food, and a letter of apology. The dog stared at us, its eyes filled with an intensity that made my skin crawl. The candles flickered, and for a moment I thought it might work. But then the dog lunged at us, its growl turning into a roar. I felt a sharp pain in my chest and everything went black. I woke up in the hospital, my cousin by my side. He looked exhausted, his face pale and drawn. "What happened?" I asked, my voice weak. "The spirit attacked us," he said. "I thought we were done for, but then it just stopped. The dog disappeared, and we were left there, unconscious. We were alive, but the spirit was still out there. We had failed to appease it, and now it was angrier than ever. I didn't know what to do. We were running out of options, and I was terrified of what would happen next." That's where things stand now, Reddit. I'm scared and desperate, and I don't know how much more I can take. If anyone out there has any advice, please, I'm begging you. I need help. I'll update you if anything changes, but for now, I'm just trying to survive. Thanks for listening. Hey Reddit, it's me again. I didn't expect to be back so soon, but things have taken a turn for the worse. I feel like I'm losing my mind, and I don't know how much longer I can keep this up. After my visit to the barn, I thought things couldn't get any worse. I was wrong. I started seeing the dog everywhere. At first, it was just in my dreams, but then I started seeing it during the day too. I'd catch a glimpse of it in the corner of my eye, but when I turned to look, it was gone. The worst part was the smell, that same rotten, decaying smell from the barn. It would come out of nowhere, filling my nostrils and making me gag. I went back to my therapist, told her everything. She tried to reassure me, saying it was just my mind playing tricks on me. She prescribed some medication to help with the anxiety and suggested I try meditation. I wanted to believe her, but it felt so real. Too real. One night I was lying in bed, trying to calm my racing thoughts. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. A message from an unknown number. "You can't escape," it read. My heart pounded in my chest. I tried to block the number, but the messages kept coming from different numbers. "You will pay." "The barn. Secrets never stay buried." I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to tell my parents everything. They needed to know what was happening. Maybe they could help. I sat them down in the living room, my hands shaking as I recounted everything. The Ouija board, the messages, the dog, the barn. They listened, their faces a mix of concern and disbelief. When I finished, there was a long silence. Finally, my dad spoke. "We need to get rid of that board," he said. "It's clearly causing you a lot of stress." My mum nodded in agreement. We drove back to my apartment that night, determined to destroy the board once and for all. When we got there, my roommates were out. I went straight to the closet where we had stored the board. It was gone. I searched the entire apartment, but it was nowhere to be found. My parents tried to calm me down, saying it was probably just misplaced, but I knew better. The board was gone, and I had a feeling it wasn't by accident. The next few days were a blur. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. I felt like I was losing my mind. The messages kept coming, more frequent and more threatening. I stopped going to classes, too scared to leave my room. My friends were worried, but they didn't understand. They couldn't. One night, I heard a scratching at my bedroom door. My heart stopped. I knew what it was. I could smell it, that same rotten, decaying smell. I sat up in bed, my eyes fixed on the door. The scratching grew louder, more frantic. I grabbed a baseball bat from under my bed, my hands shaking. I slowly opened the door, ready to swing, but there was nothing there, just the dark, empty hallway. I stepped out, my eyes darting around, trying to see in the dim light. The smell was overwhelming, making my eyes water. I heard a low growl from the living room and turned, my breath catching in my throat. There, standing in the middle of the room, was the dog. Its eyes glowed in the darkness, its fur matted and covered in dried blood. It growled again, low and menacing. I froze, my mind screaming at me to run, but my body wouldn't move. The dog took a step towards me, its eyes never leaving mine. I could feel its hot breath on my skin, the smell making me gag. It spoke again, in that same dark voice. "You will pay for what you did," it said. "Secrets never stay buried." I stumbled back, tripping over a chair and falling to the floor. The dog was on me in an instant, its teeth bared. I screamed, swinging the bat wildly, but it went right through the dog as if it wasn't there. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding in my chest, and ran to my bedroom, slamming the door behind me. I could hear the dog's growl on the other side of the door, but it didn't try to get in. I sat there, my back against the door, shaking and crying. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I packed a bag and left. I couldn't stay there anymore. I moved back in with my parents, but the dog followed me. I saw it everywhere, in the yard, in the house, even in my dreams. The messages kept coming, more threatening than ever. I was living in a constant state of fear, unable to escape. One day, I got a message that made my blood run cold. Your cousin remembers. My cousin, the one who was with me in the barn that day. I hadn't spoken to him in years. We had drifted apart after that summer, each of us too haunted by what had happened. I called him, my hands shaking. He answered on the third ring, his voice wary. "Hey," I said, my voice trembling. "It's me. We need to talk." We met at a coffee shop, both of us looking worse for wear. I told him everything, from the Ouija board to the messages to the dog. He listened, his face pale. When I finished, he looked at me with haunted eyes. "I've been getting the messages too," he said. "For years. I thought I was losing my mind. But hearing you, it's real, isn't it?" I nodded, my heart sinking. We were both trapped in this nightmare, haunted by the past. We needed to find a way to end it, but I had no idea where to start. That's where things stand now, Reddit. I'm living in constant fear, unable to escape the past. My cousin and I are trying to figure out what to do, but we're both terrified. I don't know how much more I can take. If anyone out there has any advice, please, I'm begging you, I need help. I'll update you if anything changes, but for now, I'm just trying to survive. Thanks for listening. Part 4. Hey Reddit, it's me again. I'm back with what I hope will be the final update. Things have escalated in ways I never thought possible. If you've been following my story, you know it's been a nightmare. This is the last part, and I'm hoping it ends here. After my cousin and I met with the historian, we felt a sliver of hope. She had given us some direction, something to hold on to. We decided to take her advice and return to the barn one last time. We needed to confront the spirit, apologize, and try to make amends. We prepared ourselves mentally and physically. We gathered offerings that were significant to us. A photo of us as kids, a family heirloom, and a handwritten letter of apology. We also brought some protective charms the historian had given us, hoping they would offer some kind of shield against whatever we were about to face. That night, we drove back to the farm. The drive was silent, both of us lost in our thoughts. The barn loomed in the distance, a dark silhouette against the night sky. My heart was pounding in my chest as we approached it, the smell of decay already starting to seep into the car. We stepped out, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The barn door creaked open, and the cold air hit us like a slap. We lit the candles and set up the altar just like before. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely light the match. We stood in the circle, holding hands, and began to call out to the spirit. The temperature dropped even further, and the dog appeared almost immediately, its eyes glowing with anger and pain. It growled, a sound that sent shivers down my spine. I took a deep breath and stepped forward. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice trembling. "I'm sorry for what happened. We were just kids. We didn't know what we were doing. Please, forgive us." The dog growled louder, its eyes narrowing. My cousin joined me, his voice shaking. "We're trying to make it right," he said. "Please, let us make amends." We placed the offerings on the altar, hoping they would be enough. The dog stared at us, its eyes filled with an intensity that made my skin crawl. The candles flickered, and for a moment I thought it might work. But then the dog lunged at us, its growl turning into a roar. I felt a sharp pain in my chest and everything went black. I woke up in the hospital, my cousin by my side. He looked exhausted, his face pale and drawn. "What happened?" I asked, my voice weak. "The spirit attacked us," he said. "I thought we were done for, but then it just stopped." The dog disappeared, and we were left there, unconscious. We were alive, but the spirit was still out there. We had failed to appease it, and now it was angrier than ever. I didn't know what to do. We were running out of options, and I was terrified of what would happen next. That's where things stand now, Reddit. I'm scared and desperate, and I don't know how much more I can take. If anyone out there has any advice, please, I'm begging you. I need help. I'll update you if anything changes, but for now, I'm just trying to survive. Thanks for listening. Hey Reddit, it's me again. This will be my final update. Things have gone beyond anything I could have imagined. If you followed my story, you know it's been a living nightmare. Here's what happened next. After our failed attempt to appease the spirit in the barn, my cousin and I were left with nowhere to turn. We were exhausted, terrified, and desperate. My cousin suggested one last attempt, a full exorcism. It sounded extreme, but we were out of options. We contacted a renowned exorcist, someone with a reputation for dealing with the darkest of hauntings. We told him everything, and he agreed to help. He warned us that it would be dangerous, that we might not come out of it unscathed, but we were willing to take the risk. The night of the exorcism, we gathered in the barn once more. The exorcist brought a team with him, a priest, a psychic, and an assistant. They set up a circle of protection and began their preparations. The air was thick with tension and fear. As they started the ritual, the temperature plummeted, the candles flickered, and the dog appeared, more menacing than ever. It growled, a sound that seemed to come from the very depths of hell. The exorcist began to chant, his voice strong and unwavering. The dog lunged at him, but it was stopped by an invisible barrier. It howled in rage, thrashing against the protection circle. The psychic began to speak, her voice strained. "It's angry," she said. "It wants justice. It wants revenge." I stepped forward, my heart pounding. "We're sorry," I said, my voice trembling. "We were kids. We didn't know what we were doing. Please, forgive us." The dog's eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment I saw something in them. Pain, betrayal, sorrow. The exorcist continued his chant, his voice rising in intensity. The dog howled again, a sound that echoed through the barn. Then, everything went silent. The dog vanished, the temperature returned to normal, and the candles stopped flickering. The exorcist lowered his hands, his face pale and drawn. "It's done," he said, his voice weary. "The spirit has been banished." I collapsed to my knees, tears streaming down my face. My cousin hugged me, both of us shaking with relief and exhaustion. We had finally done it. We had faced our past, made amends, and banished the spirit that had haunted us for so long. The exorcist and his team left, leaving us alone in the barn. We sat there for a long time, just holding each other, grateful to be alive. We knew we had a long road ahead of us, but for the first time in years, we felt a glimmer of hope. That was a few weeks ago. The nightmares have stopped, the messages have ceased, and the dog hasn't appeared since. I'm finally starting to feel like myself again. My cousin and I have grown closer through this ordeal, and we're determined to move forward and live our lives free from the past. Thank you, Reddit, for listening to my story and for your support. It's been a harrowing journey, but we made it through. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that you can't escape your past, but you can face it and make amends. And sometimes that's enough. This is my final update. I'm ready to put this behind me and move on. Thanks again, and stay safe. I was skeptical about the Ouija board, but now I'm a believer. So let me start by saying, I never believed in any of that paranormal stuff. Ghosts, demons, Ouija boards. All of it seemed like nonsense to me. I used to laugh at my friends when they got spooked by a weird noise or a flickering light. I was the ultimate skeptic. That was until last month when everything changed. Now I wish I could go back to being that clueless, skeptical guy. I wish I could unsee what I've seen. It all started innocently enough. My buddy, Mike, threw a housewarming party at his new place, an old, creaky Victorian house he'd just bought. The house had this eerie vibe from the start, but we chalked it up to its age and all the creaking. The night was going great. Drinks, music, everyone having a good time. That's when Sarah, Mike's girlfriend, suggested we try the Ouija board. I rolled my eyes, but everyone else seemed into it, and I didn't want to be the buzzkill. Sarah claimed the board had been in the attic when they moved in. It looked ancient, the wood worn, and the letters faded. She said it would be fun to try and contact the spirits of the house. I reluctantly agreed, figuring it would just be a laugh. We gathered around the living room table, the board set up in the centre with candles flickering around us. There were 6 of us: Mike, Sarah, me, my girlfriend Jess, and 2 other friends, Dave and Lisa. We all placed our fingers on the planchette, and Sarah started with the usual questions. "Is there anyone here with us?" she asked. At first, nothing happened. I was ready to call it a night, but then the planchette started to move. Slowly, it slid to yes. I snorted, thinking someone was messing with us, but then it started to spell out a name, EMMA. None of us knew an Emma, and that's when things started to get weird. Jess asked, "How did you die, Emma?" The planchette moved faster this time, spelling out MURDER. We all looked at each other, the atmosphere growing tense. Dave laughed nervously, but there was an unease in his eyes. We kept asking questions, and Emma's story unfolded in chilling detail. She was a young girl who had lived in the house in the late 1800s. Her father had gone mad and killed her and her mother before hanging himself in the attic. The planchette moved to attics repeatedly, almost as if urging us to go up there. Sarah, clearly spooked but intrigued, suggested we check out the attic. Against my better judgment, we all agreed. The creaky stairs seemed to go on forever, each step echoing in the silent house. When we reached the attic, it was filled with old furniture, dusty boxes, and cobwebs. But there was something else too, a heavy, oppressive feeling that made my skin crawl. Mike found an old chest, and, driven by curiosity, or maybe just to prove how brave he was, opened it. Inside were old clothes, toys, and a diary. The diary belonged to Emma. The entries were heartbreaking, detailing the growing madness of her father and the fear she and her mother felt. The last entry was a scrawl, almost illegible, as if written in a hurry. It said, "He's coming. We're hiding in the attic. If anyone finds this, beware the shadows." As we read that last line, the room grew colder, and a sense of dread washed over us. Jess whispered that she felt like we were being watched. I tried to laugh it off, but then Lisa screamed. She pointed to the corner of the attic, where a dark figure seemed to be emerging from the shadows. It was a tall, gaunt man with hollow eyes and a twisted smile. He looked like a nightmare brought to life. We bolted down the stairs, tripping over each other in our panic. In the chaos, I lost sight of Jess. When we finally regrouped in the living room, she was missing. The panic set in deeper as we called out for her, our voices echoing in the empty house. Suddenly, we heard her scream from upstairs. It was a blood-curdling scream that chilled me to the bone. Racing back up, we found Jess in the attic, but she wasn't alone. The dark figure was behind her, its bony hand gripping her shoulder. She was pale, tears streaming down her face. The figure leaned in and whispered something in her ear before vanishing into thin air. Jess collapsed, sobbing uncontrollably. We managed to get her downstairs, but she was never the same after that night. She wouldn't talk about what happened, and her eyes had this haunted look. The days following the incident were a blur of nightmares and sleepless nights. We all started experiencing strange things. Shadows moving in the corners of our vision, whispers in the dead of night, and that oppressive feeling of being watched. Mike tried to get rid of the Ouija board, but no matter what he did, it kept coming back. He burned it, threw it away, even tried to bury it, but it always returned to the attic, waiting for us. I haven't seen most of the group since that night. Mike and Sarah moved out, refusing to speak of what happened. Dave and Lisa broke up, unable to cope with the fear. And Jess is in a psychiatric hospital now, her mind shattered by whatever that thing whispered to her. I still don't believe in ghosts, not really. but I believe in something darker, something that feeds on our fear and despair. If you ever come across a Ouija board, I beg you, don't use it. Some doors should never be opened. After that night, I thought I could just move on and forget about everything, but it turned out to be impossible. The events in Mike's house stuck with me like a bad dream, except I couldn't wake up from it. I'd see Jess's haunted eyes every time I closed mine. It wasn't just the memory of her scream or the shadowy figure. It was the knowledge that something was out there, something we had stirred up. About a week after that night, strange things started happening to me. It began with small stuff. I'd find objects in my apartment moved around or hear faint whispers just as I was drifting off to sleep. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I was just jumpy. Maybe the stress was getting to me. But then things escalated. One night, I woke up to find scratches on my arms. They were deep, angry red marks that stung like hell. I lived alone, and I knew I couldn't have done it to myself in my sleep. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I must have scratched myself unconsciously, but the scratches kept appearing, getting worse each time. I even set up my phone to record myself sleeping, desperate to catch some logical explanation. What I saw on that footage still gives me chills. Around 3 a.m, the footage showed me lying still. Then my body jerked violently. The camera picked up faint whispers, indecipherable, but they sounded angry. And then something invisible seemed to press down on me, causing the scratches. It was like watching a horror movie, but it was real, and it was happening to me. Desperate, I reached out to Mike and Sarah. They hadn't been speaking to anyone since the incident, but when I explained what was happening, they reluctantly agreed to meet up. We met at a diner, the bright lights and hum of conversation offering a brief respite from the darkness that had been following me. Mike looked terrible, pale, unshaven, and with dark circles under his eyes. Sarah wasn't much better. They both admitted they'd been experiencing strange things too. Objects moving, cold spots in their new apartment, and like me, they had seen scratches appearing on their bodies. Sarah even showed me a particularly nasty gash on her leg. It was clear we had unleashed something, and it wasn't going to leave us alone. We decided to do some research on the house and the Ouija board. After hours of digging through old records and newspaper archives, we found out that the house had a dark history. Several families had lived there over the years, and almost all of them had met with tragic ends. Unexplained deaths, disappearances, and in one case, a family murder-suicide that eerily matched the story Emma had told us. The Ouija board itself was even older than the house, rumoured to have been used in dark rituals by a cult in the early 1800s. The more we read, the more hopeless it seemed. Whatever we had contacted, it wasn't just a restless spirit. It was something much darker, something malevolent. In a last-ditch effort, we decided to contact a paranormal expert. Through some online forums, we found a guy named Peter who specialised in demonic hauntings. He sounded like a bit of a nut, but at this point, we were willing to try anything. We met him at Mike's place, and from the moment he walked in, he seemed on edge. Peter performed a cleansing ritual, chanting in Latin and burning sage. As he worked, the atmosphere in the room grew heavy, almost suffocating. Suddenly, the temperature dropped, and we all saw our breath fogging in front of us. Peter's voice faltered, and then something invisible seemed to lash out at him, knocking him to the ground. He scrambled to his feet, shouting at us to get out. We didn't need to be told twice. We ran out of the house, piling into our cars and driving to the nearest bar, needing the comfort of light and people around us. Peter joined us later, looking shaken. He told us that what we were dealing with was beyond his ability to handle. He believed it was a demonic entity, drawn to the board and now latched onto us. Peter suggested we find a way to destroy the board, but we told him about our previous failed attempts. He then mentioned a ritual he had heard of, something incredibly risky that might sever the entity's connection to us. It involved returning to the house, confronting the entity, and destroying the board in a very specific way. He warned us that if we failed, it could make things even worse. Despite our fear, We knew we had to try. Living with this nightmare was no longer an option. We gathered the necessary items for the ritual: candles, salt, and a specific type of wood to burn the board. With heavy hearts and trembling hands, we prepared to return to the place where it all began. That night, as we stood outside the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into a trap. The house loomed over us, its windows like dark, soulless eyes. We took a deep breath and stepped inside, hoping we had the strength to face whatever awaited us. We walked into the house, the air thick with dread. The familiar creaks of the old wood under our feet were a stark reminder of the horrors we had experienced here. The candles in our hands flickered, as if warning us to turn back, but we pushed forward. The plan was simple, but terrifying. Perform the ritual in the attic where it all began. Confront the entity and destroy the board once and for all. As we ascended the stairs, every shadow seemed to stretch and reach out, the darkness almost tangible. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in the silent house. When we reached the attic, we set up the candles in a circle, surrounding the board. Peter instructed us to sprinkle salt around the candles, creating a protective barrier. His voice was steady, but I could see the fear in his eyes. We all joined hands, standing around the board. Peter began chanting in Latin, his voice resonating through the attic. The temperature dropped sharply, and the oppressive feeling returned, pressing down on us. Suddenly, the planchette moved on its own, spelling out G-E-T-O-U-T. Peter's chanting grew louder, more urgent. The shadows in the room seemed to writhe and twist, forming into that dark figure we had seen before. It stood just outside the circle, watching us with those hollow eyes and that twisted smile. The sense of malevolence it exuded was overwhelming. As Peter continued the ritual, the figure started to laugh, a low, guttural sound that sent chills down my spine. It began to speak, its voice like nails on a chalkboard. "You think you can banish me? I have been here for centuries. You are mine." I could feel my resolve weakening, my hands trembling as I gripped Mike and Sarah's hands. Peter shouted for us to stay strong, but it was hard to focus with the entity's laughter echoing in my head. Suddenly, the candles flickered and went out, plunging us into darkness. In the pitch black, I felt something cold and slimy brush against my face. I recoiled, breaking the circle. The entity seized the opportunity, rushing towards us. I heard Sarah scream, a blood-curdling sound that pierced through the darkness. I fumbled for my phone, turning on the flashlight. The beam of light revealed the entity standing over Sarah, its hand gripping her shoulder just like it had with Jess. Its face was inches from hers, whispering something that made her eyes widen in terror. I lunged forward, trying to pull her away, but it felt like I was moving through molasses. The entity's grip was unyielding, its eyes locking onto mine. Peter yelled out an incantation, his voice breaking through the entity's hold. It released Sarah, who collapsed to the ground, sobbing. The entity turned its gaze towards Peter, who continued chanting, despite the terror in his eyes. The figure lunged at him, but it hit the salt barrier and recoiled. Hissing in anger, I grabbed Sarah, pulling her back into the circle. Mike and I held her tightly, whispering reassurances even though we were just as scared. Peter's chanting grew louder, more forceful, and the entity writhed in pain, its form flickering like a bad TV signal. With a final, desperate effort, Peter shouted the last words of the ritual. The entity let out an ear-piercing scream, and for a moment everything was silent. Then the board burst into flames, the fire consuming it rapidly. The entity howled in agony, its form dissolving into smoke and shadows, drawn into the flames. We watched in stunned silence as the board was reduced to ashes. The oppressive feeling lifted, and the temperature slowly returned to normal. Peter sank to the ground, exhausted but relieved. We all sat there for a moment, catching our breath, the reality of what had just happened sinking in. The house felt different now, almost peaceful. We cleaned up the remnants of the ritual, careful to gather every piece of the burnt board and take it outside. Peter instructed us to bury the ashes far away from the house and never speak of what happened again. We followed his instructions to the letter, hoping to finally put an end to the nightmare. as we left the house for the last time. I couldn't shake the feeling that we had only scratched the surface of what was out there. The darkness we had faced was ancient and powerful, and I couldn't help but wonder if it was truly gone. But for now, we were free, and that was enough. The days that followed were a blur of relief and recovery. Jess was still in the hospital, but she seemed to be improving, her eyes slowly losing that haunted look. Mike and Sarah moved far away, wanting to put as much distance between themselves and the house as possible. Dave and Lisa tried to patch things up, but the trauma had driven a wedge between them. As for me, I moved out of my apartment, hoping a fresh start would help me forget. But some nights, I still wake up in a cold sweat, the memory of that dark figure looming over me. I try to convince myself it's just a bad dream, but deep down, I know the truth. We had tampered with something beyond our understanding, and the scars it left would never fully heal. The shadows in my room seem to linger a bit longer, the whispers on the edge of hearing, and sometimes, just sometimes, I feel a cold breath on my neck, reminding me that some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed. It's been a year since that night, and I wish I could say everything is back to normal. I've tried to move on, bury the memories deep, and pretend it was all just a bad dream. But the past has a way of creeping back, especially when you least expect it. Jess was released from the psychiatric hospital a few months ago. She's better, but she's not the same. There's a fragility to her now, like she's constantly on edge, waiting for something to go wrong. We don't talk about what happened. It's an unspoken rule between us. But sometimes I catch her staring into space, a haunted look in her eyes, and I know she's reliving that night in the attic. Mike and Sarah moved to a new city, trying to start fresh. We stay in touch sporadically, but there's a distance between us now. They're trying to forget too, but I know they're haunted by their own demons. Mike mentioned once that they still have nightmares, waking up in a cold sweat, the feeling of being watched never quite leaving them. It's a bond we share, though it's one we'd rather not have. Peter, the paranormal expert who helped us, disappeared a few months after the ritual. His number was disconnected, and his website went offline. It's like he vanished into thin air. I hope he's okay, but a part of me fears the worst. Maybe whatever we unleashed came back for him. Maybe he's still fighting his own battle, somewhere out there in the shadows. As for me, I moved to a new apartment in a different part of town. I thought a change of scenery might help, but the nightmares followed me. I tried to ignore them, telling myself they were just dreams, but they felt too real. I'd wake up with the feeling of icy fingers on my skin, the whispers growing louder each night. The scratches started appearing again, faint at first, then deeper and more frequent. One night, I woke up to find my apartment freezing cold. My breath fogged in the air, and I heard a faint whisper, just like before. I turned on the light, but the room seemed darker, the shadows thicker. The oppressive feeling returned, making it hard to breathe. I knew then that it wasn't over. Whatever we had faced in that house had followed me, and it was getting stronger. Desperate, I reached out to the only person I could think of, Dave. We hadn't spoken much since the incident, but I needed help, and I knew he'd understand. I called him in the middle of the night, my voice shaking as I explained what was happening. He agreed to come over, and within an hour, he was at my door. Dave looked just as haunted as I felt. He admitted that he'd been experiencing strange things too, shadows moving in his peripheral vision, the feeling of being watched, and the occasional unexplained scratch. We decided to confront whatever it was, once and for all. We needed to put an end to this. For good, we set up a makeshift ritual in my apartment, using what we remembered from Peter's instructions. Candles, salt, and a prayer we found online. It wasn't perfect, but it was all we had. As we began the ritual, the temperature dropped even further, and the shadows seemed to close in around us. We joined hands, our voices shaky as we chanted the prayer. The oppressive feeling grew stronger, almost suffocating, and then the whispers started, faint at first, then louder, until they were all around us. The shadows writhed, forming into that dark figure once more. It stood just outside the circle, watching us with those hollow eyes. "Leave us alone!" Dave shouted, his voice cracking with fear. "You're not welcome here." The entity laughed, a sound that sent chills down my spine. "You cannot banish me," it hissed. "I am bound to you now. You are mine." Panic set in as the entity moved closer, the air growing colder with each step. Our chanting grew louder, more desperate. The candles flickered, threatening to go out. I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder, and I nearly broke the circle. But Dave's grip tightened, grounding me. We pushed through, the prayer reaching a crescendo. The entity let out a blood-curdling scream, and for a moment I thought we had done it. But then the candles went out, plunging us into darkness. The oppressive feeling lifted slightly, but I knew it wasn't gone. Not completely. The room was silent, the air heavy with the scent of burnt candles. Dave and I sat there, catching our breath, the reality of our situation sinking in. We had managed to weaken the entity, but it wasn't banished. It was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for an opportunity to strike. We cleaned up the remnants of the ritual, our hands shaking. Dave offered to stay the night, and I gratefully accepted. We didn't sleep, too afraid of what might happen if we let our guard down. Instead, we sat in the living room, talking about anything and everything to keep our minds off the darkness that surrounded us. The next morning, we decided to seek professional help. We found a priest who specialized in exorcisms and explained our situation. He listened patiently, then agreed to help us. The exorcism was intense, more powerful than anything we had tried before. The entity fought back, but the priest was relentless, his faith unwavering. It took several hours, but eventually the oppressive feeling lifted completely. The air felt lighter, the shadows less menacing. The priest assured us that the entity was gone, banished for good this time. We thanked him profusely, a sense of relief washing over us. Life slowly returned to normal after that. The nightmares faded, and the scratches stopped appearing. Jess and I reconnected, trying to rebuild our relationship. Mike and Sarah seemed happier in their new city, and Dave and Lisa started fresh, finally finding peace. But every now and then, I still feel a cold breath on my neck, or see a shadow move out of the corner of my eye. I tell myself it's just my imagination, but deep down, I know the truth. We opened a door that night, and some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed. We've moved on, but the darkness is always there, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for an opportunity to return. So, if you ever come across a Ouija board, I beg you, don't use it. Some things are better left unknown. Some doors should never be opened. Trust me, once you let the darkness in, it's almost impossible to get rid of it, and it will haunt you for the rest of your life.